Hello, Ambassadors. I'm Dale Wells, and I welcome you to our ongoing study of the locations that we had planned to visit in Israel in April of this year, but it looks like we're going to have to do it next year instead. Maybe you were unable to attend our class this Sunday, or maybe you weren't able to see the slides on Zoom. Maybe you just want to review the material again or share it with someone else. Whatever brings you here, welcome. If you like what you see, let me know by tapping the thumbs up link. Also, if you'll tap the red subscribe link below, you'll be notified whenever I post new videos to this channel. During the month of January, we've been looking at sites around the Dead Sea and in the Judean wilderness as we head toward Jerusalem. We started this year with a look at Masada, one of the most famous sites in Jewish history, even though it's not a site that figures directly in the biblical narrative. Then we looked at En-Gedi, a place that is familiar because of how it features in the life of David as a young man fleeing from a jealous King Saul. Last week we looked at a place that's important not because of any direct connection to the biblical narrative, but because it bears witness to how the Bible texts have been divinely preserved for thousands of years. They've been copied and preserved so well that manuscripts dating back as far as 300 BC are virtually identical with Hebrew texts that were produced 1,000 years later. The thing those three sites have in common is that they are all on the eastern edge of the Judean wilderness, the place we're visiting today. Before we talk about the Judean wilderness in particular, let's think of characteristics of wilderness in general. What does wilderness mean to you? If you're like most folks in America, you tend to think of an American wilderness. You think of mountains and meadows, forests and woodlands. You think of streams and lakes, wildlife, both predators and prey. And you think of scenery that sometimes inspires awe and sometimes inspires reflection. The Wilderness Act of 1964 gave a legal definition for wilderness as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. And anyone who's ever read anything about American wilderness has come across the name of John Muir. He said, among other things, the clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness. Well, that's what we think of when we think of wilderness. But I promise you that's not what the Bible authors thought of. Wilderness in the Bible is not the same as American wilderness. You're looking at a picture of the Judean wilderness that we'll travel through when we get to Israel. It's one thing to drive through it on an asphalt highway in an air-conditioned bus, but it's an entirely different thing to walk through it in the blazing desert heat of day, day after day, and to sleep in the cold of night as the heat of the desert dissipates into the cloudless sky every night. A huge part of the Bible land is wilderness, about 60%. From the Negev to the tip of the Sinai Peninsula, and from the Gulf of Suez east to the Arabian Desert. The Sinai Peninsula is about 130 miles east to west and about 240 miles north to south. It encompasses about 23,000 square miles. That doesn't count the Judean wilderness that we'll drive through. That Judean wilderness is about 50 miles north to south and 15 miles east to west, runs alongside Jericho and the western shore of the Dead Sea, encompasses about 750 square miles. But in the Bible land, in particular the land of the Old Testament, there are 7 different wildernesses that are discussed at various points in the narrative. There's the wilderness of Shur and Etham and Sin. There's the wilderness of Paran and Zin. There's the Arabah and the Judean wilderness. And each of those wilderness areas is different. Here's a picture of the wilderness of Shur. And a little farther down the Sinai Peninsula, the wilderness of Etham. When you get down near the tip of the Sinai Peninsula, you come into the wilderness of Sin. You're looking at a mountain called Jebel Musa. That means Moses Mountain. This is the traditional site of Mount Sinai, and it's situated in what's called the Desert of Sin. Now, the Desert of Sin doesn't have anything to do with misbehavior. It's called the Desert of Sin because it's Sinai. And so sometimes you might read the Wilderness of Sinai or the Wilderness of Sin. Then there's the Wilderness of Paran that takes up much of the central section of the Sinai Peninsula. A little further north and butted up right against the southern area of Judah is the Wilderness of Zin, Z-I-N, not to be confused with the Wilderness of Sin, S-I-N. The area between the southern end of the Dead Sea and the northern end of the Gulf of Aqaba is an area called the Arabah. Then, of course, there is the Judean wilderness that we will drive through when we are in Israel. So you can see that all of these wilderness areas are different, and yet they have certain things in common. Wilderness is vast and rugged. About 60% of the Bible land is hostile to human habitation. And that's because it's defined by what it lacks. It lacks water. It's a land of little water. Sometimes it's due to the distance from the Mediterranean Sea. Sometimes it's because it sits just on the other side of mountains that prevent rainfall from reaching the area, like the Judean wilderness, where it becomes kind of a rain shadow, like we're familiar with in the Coachella Valley. Because it's a land with little water, it's a land without crops. One of the hardiest crops that can be raised in Israel is barley. And barley is a coarse grain that's used primarily for cattle feed. Well, it takes 12 inches of rain per year to raise barley. The biblical wildernesses get sometimes 2 inches, sometimes 4 inches, never more than that. Wilderness is a land with very few permanent settlements. Because the people were so dependent upon raising crops to live, about 1/3 of the ancient Near East diet was grain. If you have no crops, you don't have any sustenance to support a population. So without water, without crops, you don't have permanent settlements. And wilderness, consequently, is a place with very few travelers. They need food and they need water. They need villages. They need places to stay for the night. They need places to replenish their supplies. Because people walk from place to place, they'd often take longer routes in order to avoid wilderness. That explains the Fertile Crescent. You recall, as we've talked about Israel before now, we've mentioned this Fertile Crescent many times. When Abraham and people from Ur of the Chaldees over in the Tigris-Euphrates River areas, whenever they traveled over into the Levant area where Israel is, they traveled around that Fertile Crescent in order to go from Mesopotamia to as far down as Egypt. And they did that going hundreds of miles out of their way in order to avoid the Syrian or Arabian desert. So you see, that desert has a lack of water, a lack of crops, a lack of settlements, a lack of travelers. Because of that, it has lack of borders. If no one can live there anyway, no one fights over borders and territory. No one really cares who owns the land. In other words, wilderness is a land that lacks everything. Almost all of our definitions of biblical wilderness are in terms of what it lacks. There's a great text in Jeremiah chapter 2 that describes wilderness. This is what the Lord says, Jeremiah 2 verses 5 and 6. What fault did your ancestors find in me that they strayed so far from me? They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. They did not ask, where is the Lord who brought us up out of Egypt and led us through the barren wilderness, through a land of deserts and ravines, a land of drought and utter darkness, a land where no one travels and no one lives. Did you see that definition? Barren wilderness, deserts, ravines, drought, darkness, no one travels, no one lives. So you can see how wilderness is defined in terms of everything that it's missing. But how does God use wilderness? how does God use wilderness in the Bible narrative, and how does God use wilderness in our lives? You know, one of the greatest stories of Scripture, one of the longest episodes of God's dealing with His people, had to do with wilderness. The wilderness areas of the Sinai Peninsula house the longest and most surprising wilderness story in the Bible. The book of Genesis has God promising Abraham, when he leaves Ur of the Chaldees and travels around the Fertile Crescent to the promised land of Canaan, that he's going to give him and his family an inheritance in Canaan, that he'll have descendants as numerous as the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky, that he'll be a blessing to everyone, all nations of the earth. The promise is that Abraham and his family are going to produce the Savior, and their inheritance is going to be in Canaan. And yet, when the book of Genesis ends, the patriarchs, Abraham's family, are in Egypt. They're not in Canaan. And when Exodus begins, they're slaves in Egypt, not masters. And when God brought Israel out of Egypt, instead of taking them along the way of the sea, just following the seacoast of the Mediterranean Sea, He turned them south into one wilderness after another. Imagine the surprise of Moses and the Israelites when God turned the people south toward the desert rather than north along the way of the sea toward Canaan. Is God's GPS somehow faulty? Can you imagine Moses looking at his Waze app and reading, "Arriving in 40 years? That can't be right." Or is there a reason that Israel spent 2 years in the wilderness before their first opportunity to enter the Promised Land, and another 38 years before their second chance? You see, when God brought Israel out of Egypt, instead of turning them north along the way of the sea, He led them south into the wilderness. And they followed through the wildernesses in kind of a counterclockwise way, going through the wilderness of Shur and the wilderness of Etham, and then down to the wilderness of Sin, where they spent 1 year at Mount Sinai. During that time, they get the 10 Commandments. During that time, they get the instructions about how to build the tabernacle. They build the tabernacle, and then with the tabernacle, they start north toward Kadesh Barnea, traveling through the wilderness of Paran to the wilderness of Zin. At Kadesh Barnea, they balked at the command to enter the land, and as a result, they spent another 38 years in the wilderness. Time for one generation to die before their children got the chance to enter the land. Now, that story in itself is powerful. But when we realize that God has cared for these people day by day in this hostile environment for 40 years, it's just unimaginable that they wouldn't have learned to trust God. But they're a lot like we are. We don't learn very well either. How does God use wilderness? Well, He uses wilderness to humble us. God hates arrogance. That is the motivation for the first sin men ever committed, and it's been the motivation for every sin thereafter. The book of Deuteronomy is fashioned around some sermons that Moses preached during the last year of his life. And remember that he's giving these sermons to the people who are about to enter the land, not the ones who come out of Egypt, but their children. And he reminds them about how God has taken care of them all these past 40 years. In Deuteronomy 8, verses 2 and 3, you read this: "Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years, to humble and test you, in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep His commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." Wilderness humbles us. Think about it. When Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees, he left civilization for the boonies. When Israel left Egypt, they left civilization for the wilderness. Egypt was one of the most desirable places to live in the ancient world. When the world was stricken with famine, everybody gravitated to Egypt because that's where the infrastructure was to support them through the famine. Everybody went to Egypt. Even today, people go to Egypt to marvel at the human achievements that date back to Moses' day and even before, the pyramids and other great works of architecture that were put together by men way back in those days, 1400, 1500 years BC. Wilderness, you see, is everything Egypt is not. Wilderness is a place without food. Egypt's got food. Wilderness is a place without water. Egypt's got water. And wilderness is a place without human innovation and infrastructure, both of which are things that you have in Egypt. So wilderness humbles us. It also tests us. The basic question that underlies the entire wilderness narrative in the book of Exodus is whether people will trust God. Will you trust me in this place without food, without water, without civilization? It humbles us. It tests us. Will you trust me? Notice what the test is. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep His commands. Will you trust me in this place without food, without water, without civilization? Unfortunately, the answer of the Exodus generation was no, we won't. So you read in places like Numbers 20, verses 2 to 5. There was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink." What are they saying? They're saying, we would rather be slaves in Egypt than in this terrible place. So Moses, either take us to Promised Land or take us back to Egypt, but get us out of here. Here are people that God has been providing for day by day for all of these years, but they don't trust God to provide for them tomorrow. And so they say, we'd rather go back to Egypt than stay in this terrible place. Now, did you notice about how God provided when He provided the things that the people needed? Wilderness is designed to humble us, to test us, and is designed to teach us. Did you notice in Deuteronomy 8, verses 2 and 3, how the text says, He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna? What God did is He waited till the need arose and then met the need. When they were hungry, He gave them manna. When they tired of the manna, He gave them quail. When they needed water, He caused water to come out of the rock. I don't know about you. I grew up in Bible class, and I remember seeing those little postcard-sized pictures of Moses standing beside that rock that's not much bigger than he is, with his stick in his hand, his rod in his hand, and he struck the rock, and then a little trickle of water comes out. Oh, don't think about that being the way he watered the people in the desert. How many people were there in the Exodus generation anyway? Well, at the beginning of Numbers, there's a census of how many fighting men there were in Israel, and there were over 600,000 fighting men. At the end of Numbers, there's another census of how many Israelites there were going into the Promised Land. And again, about 40 years later, you've got about 600,000 fighting men. Now, those fighting men are married, and they and their wives have children. And then there are some people who are too old to fight. So, in all, the people who came out of Egypt and the people who went into Promised Land a generation later would have been a couple of million people. So when God watered those people and their animals from the rock, that was no small trickle of water. Think about what else God has done for them through the 40 years in the wilderness. They're led by that fiery cloud. It's called a cloud, a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night in the King James Version. It's really one thing, not two. It's called the Shekinah cloud. And it provided shelter from the sun during the heat of the desert day. It provided light and warmth at night. And God took care of the Israelites every day for 40 years to teach them that He's trustworthy, that He'll give them what they need when they need it. He doesn't give them a storehouse and then say, go to the storehouse and fill up your coffers, and when you're done, I'll replenish it. No, every day He gives them what they need for that day. We can be a lot like Israel. We want to go back to our Egypt rather than trust God for our daily bread. But notice the message that they were supposed to have been taught. He humbled you, verse 3, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So wilderness is designed to humble us, to test us, to teach us. Every day Israel got up and found manna on the ground. All they had to do was pick it up, and they had plenty to eat and to feed their animals. And the next day there was more, and the next day there was more. There was always enough for the day, never more than enough, but God provided what they needed when they needed it. That makes me think about the prayer that Jesus taught His disciples to pray. When Jesus taught His disciples to pray, we're familiar with that passage in Matthew 6:11 that says, "Give us this day our daily bread." You know, I've always been a little concerned about the way that passage sounds in most of our translations. It sounds like we're standing up at the pay window with our hands out saying to God, okay, it's a new day, here, pay up, give me some bread. That's not the idea at all. The idea is that I am absolutely dependent upon God. I have to rely upon God to give me what I need, not what I'm due, because I'm not due anything. So I found some other translations that I think give us probably a better idea about what the text means. Give us today the food we need, or give us our food for today, or give us the food we need for today. Give us the food we need. Give us the food we need for each day. But I kind of like the Living Bible and the Voice. The Living Bible, give us our food again today as usual. In other words, you fed us yesterday, feed us today, and we'll trust you to feed us tomorrow. This is the way you've been taking care of us. Or the Voice, give us each day that day's bread, no more, no less. Well, what does all of that have to do with the Judean wilderness? We're talking about the wilderness in the Sinai Peninsula. We're talking about the wilderness of Shur and Etham and Sin and Paran and Zin. What about the Judean wilderness? Well, there's a great wilderness tale in Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 to 4, and that is Jesus' temptation. The easiest thing in the world for us to do is to look at the temptation narrative and not tie it back to its Old Testament roots. We connect the first temptation to the next two, but what we really need to do is connect it back to Israel in the wilderness. Jesus has fasted 40 days. Israel is in the wilderness 40 years. The desert is beautiful from the bus, but it's terrifying on the ground. Here's what we read. Matthew 4, verses 1 to 4. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." So we read, Jesus was led by the Spirit in the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. What's happened at the end of chapter 3? Jesus has been baptized. He's been announced to the world by John the Baptist as the Messiah. He's been explained by God's own voice to be God's Son in whom He is pleased. There's that voice from heaven, and there's that Spirit settling on Him like a dove. And then we read that from that point on, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Well, the wilderness is a desert. Because of its lack of water and good roots, the Judean wilderness has been mostly uninhabited throughout history. Consequently, it was an ideal place for people who were seeking refuge from enemies or retreat from the world. John the Baptist preached here. It's probably the location where Jesus was baptized and where He was tempted. Here's a look at the Judean wilderness west of Jericho. And another view of it looking kind of to the north, down the Wadi Kilt or along the Wadi Kilt. And here's a view of the Judean wilderness toward the Dead Sea. Everywhere you look, you see desolation. Now, the traditional Mount of Temptation is conveniently located near Jericho. I don't think it's actually where the temptation took place. I think, as is often the case, religious folks through the years have selected places where travelers can get to and said, this is where this happened. Well, it's unlikely that Jesus' temptation took place basically in the suburbs of Jericho. It was much more likely that it was in a more remote part of the wilderness. But this is the monastery of the Temptation near Jericho, where the Byzantines located their monastery on what is called Jebel Quarantal, that is, the Mount of the 40, named for the 40 days of temptation. Now you remember that Matthew 4:2 says, after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, Jesus was hungry. Back in Exodus chapter 34, there's a passage we need to connect that with in our minds. In Exodus 34, verse 28, the passage that I have outlined here, we read, Moses was there on Sinai with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights without eating bread or drinking water. So, Matthew intends for us to connect Jesus' experience in the wilderness with Moses' experience on the mountain. Now that text in Exodus 34, verse 28 goes on to tell us, and he wrote on the tablets the word of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. But in Jesus' day, the tempter comes to him and says, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. Here are stones in the Judean wilderness, near the ascent of Adumim, that road from Jerusalem to Jericho we talked about a few weeks ago. And you know that stones can sometimes resemble a loaf of bread. Satan is saying, take what you've created, these stones, and change them into bread. You can feed yourself. Here's what bread would have looked like. You've got here a picture of barley grain and a barley loaf just to the side of it. And you've got wheat and a wheat loaf just to the side of it. And Jesus answers the tempter with a quotation from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the books of Moses. And he says, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. So he refutes the devil by quoting from Deuteronomy. But it's not just that he quotes from Deuteronomy, he quotes from a particular place in Deuteronomy where Israel is in the wilderness being cared for by God. The place that we looked at a few moments ago in Deuteronomy 8 verse 3, where we read, he humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Do you see what's going on here? Satan is asking Jesus to shortcut God's plan. He's asking Jesus not to trust God. In this picture, just like Israel in the Old Testament, Israel had no way to provide food for themselves. They had no way to provide water for themselves. And short of using his divine power, Jesus cannot feed himself. There's nothing there for him to eat. Do you see the similarities between Israel and Jesus in the wilderness? Both were led into the wilderness by God. When Israel leaves Egypt, God turns them south through the wilderness to Mount Sinai. When Jesus comes up from the waters of baptism, the Spirit leads him into the wilderness. Both were humbled in the wilderness. Israel couldn't provide for itself. As I said, this is not a small group of people. This is a couple of million people in the desert with no food, no water, no provisions, except what they had on their backs. They had to rely on God completely. And they didn't. They didn't want to, and they refused. Well, Jesus has the same opportunity. Relying on his own human strength, he couldn't provide for himself either. And in order to provide for himself, he'd have to show that he didn't trust God. You see, both were tested in the wilderness with that question, will you trust me, even though you don't see the absolute necessities for survival in sight? Both were taught to trust God in the wilderness. The difference is that Jesus succeeds where they and we fail. Jesus succeeded in the same context, in a wilderness where Israel failed. Jesus came to do what we cannot do and to undo what we've done. We owe God a debt we can't pay. And what Jesus does is he substitutes himself for them and for us. Substitution's the key. Jesus substitutes himself for us. He lives out the obedience that Israel owed God but couldn't deliver. He substitutes himself by living out the obedience that we owe God and cannot deliver. He replicated the experience of Israel in the past so he could succeed where Israel failed. He lived the perfect life we can't. And that means Jesus puts salvation into action. We see him living out the obedience Israel and we cannot, and even when we fail to live up to the trust God asks of us, Jesus has already succeeded on our behalf. It makes me think of that great text by the Hebrew writer in Hebrews 4:15. This high priest of ours, Jesus, understands our weaknesses, for he faced all of the same testings we do, yet he did not sin. Are you going through a wilderness? Maybe you've received some bad news from a doctor. Maybe you've got someone close to you who's sick. Maybe you've lost someone close to you. Maybe you're having trouble at work, or maybe you're having struggles to try to keep life going from month to month because of dwindling supplies and dwindling money. Are you going through a wilderness? Your key to surviving in the wilderness is trusting God. You'll never know Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. Are you in the wilderness? Find refuge in God's presence. Find comfort in his people. Well, that's our look at the Judean wilderness. Next week, we'll take a look at Jerusalem, an overview of it through the Scriptures. In the meantime, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.